Okay, how old were you at the time of the Cold War?
Well, let's see, 1943, and after the war, 1945, and the actual Cold War started in the late 40s, early 50s, so I was only maybe 7. Original one, what happened was that the U.S., the Germans, the French, and the Russians, and who else? There was at least 4 countries. What they did was they split up Germany, and the U.S. had so much, they didn't own the property, but they were in charge of it. Well, the Russians had the east side of Berlin, and so they took that over, and then when the Cold War actually started, what happened was they froze all these other countries from bringing in food into Germany. So they were airlifting plane after plane and loads and loads and loads of food, because nobody had any food there in Germany because of the war. And so then that's really what started the Cold War. And then the Russians, that's when they started building the wall around Berlin so that you couldn't get through to East. It was East Germany then. And it went on for, 30 years. And
Well, she wants to know how old you were when it basically started.
probably 7 or 8.
And do you remember in school, like, hearing about it? Did your
Oh
teachers
yeah,
talk
I heard
about
about it all the time.
Yeah.
It wasn't as bad, but what happened.
But back to it, so your teachers would always talk about it in class and stuff?
Well, not always, but what would happen was that once the Russians started building the wall around East Berlin, you couldn't get in, you couldn't get out. And then what you'd hear is stories about no food on the west side, and them having to airlift and drop all these things to all these people because they had no food. I mean, 0 amounts of food. But what you heard about was that the Russians put up all these towers with machine guns on them, and people that were trying to escape from East Germany to West Germany, they were killing them, and they probably killed over the lifetime of the wall, I don't know, 40, 50,000 people.
Yeah.
They actually dug trenches and dug underneath the wall and did all kinds of things, and you'd hear about it on the news, where another 10 guys, what they did was they built, like, the wall was here, and then in between the wall was maybe an area of about 75 to 100 feet, so these guys would climb over the first wall, run across and try to jump over the second wall, and they'd shoot them down, and they'd kill them all. And so you heard about this, and it went on for the longest time, but then what happened was many years later, the Russian economy was terrible, and the East German economy was even worse. So they didn't have any food, they didn't have anything there at all, and everything that they were building there was just crap. And they'd build cars, like little cars with motorcycle engines in them, and that's what everybody drove around there, but they were a pile of junk, like I said. And then finally, I can remember Bryant Gumbel, who's did the news. He was in East Germany when they, that was after Reagan was president, saying, tear down the wall, tear down Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall. And eventually they tore it down, and there's only one little section in Germany now where there's still parts of the wall. The rest of it's all gone. People took it, for samples and, all that. But I mean, it was bad. It really was bad. Bad for the whole world.
Do you remember hearing about the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Oh yeah, everybody heard.
We were in high school. I was in St. Bernard's then.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis was, it was on the news, but we were in California, and we didn't realize how bad it was.
We did.
No, not to the extent that the people
we were almost going to war.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is the people, since it was in Cuba, it was closer to Florida
Yeah.
and North Carolina and all the East Coast. So they had all these ships that went down there to blockade all the Russian ships coming in. And you heard about it, you know, but you didn't hear, you know, we gave the Russians an ultimatum: either you turn the boats around with all your missile stuff on the boats, or we're going to sink them. And then they said, well, they were worried about this going to start a third world war with Russia. And then Khrushchev pulled out. He couldn't. They knew that they didn't want to go to war. So, but it was a.
Stand up.
But we had pictures of this U-2 spy plane where they actually showed the missile launch sites in Cuba and everything else. And,
So were you living on the West Coast during the Cold War? Where were you living?
the whole time I lived in California all my life. The people, you know, like I said, with the Cuban thing, it was a little bit different because a lot of the ships came from back east, you know, from Connecticut, New York, all that. You know, they would have to come through the Panama Canal, and that would have been a long trip. So, you know, this went on for quite a while, and you know, every day there was something in the news about, you know, the
So
Cuban.
we didn't have any relatives fighting
No.
at that time
No.
in our
No,
family.
no. So there might have been some kids I went to school with that were on the ships.
Yeah, but
but,
she's.
no,
about
we
the
had
age
nobody
now.
in our family that was there. Yeah, because my brother Scott,
Yeah.
he would have been, he missed it by about 2 years or something like that. Because he was up in San Francisco,
Mm.
you know, but it was,
And he never went to Vietnam either.
you know, and we didn't really, in California, we didn't feel it as much in the Cold War, you know, because we were still building things and we were busy here in California and the economy was growing and all that stuff, and you know, so they didn't feel it as much as some other parts of the country, you know. And typically that's what happens, you know, they get, you know, let's say for instance if something happened in Alaska, you know, I mean, you know, they would have the people from Seattle and Portland and they would go up there and the West Coast would all go up there, but it was an interesting time.